I really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your night to sit with us and learn about mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless right now is definitely a hot trend and a hot topic, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. So hopefully some of you already there are shooting with mirrorless, and for those of you who aren't, hopefully this will give you some more insight about it and help you better decide if mirrorless is going to be right for you or not. So just as an introduction, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Noah Buchanan, and I work for Hunt's Photo and Video, and we're a retailer based out of New England area, which I did mention a little bit earlier, but for those of you who weren't on then and didn't hear that, we have 8 retail locations throughout New England, so Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. I've been with the company for 4 years now and focus on a lot of different trade shows and events and working with different camera clubs. Some of you may also know Gary Farber, who I work very closely with, and did want me to say hello to everyone as well. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. My portion of the program is about 35, 40 minutes or so. There will be a spot in the middle where I'll stop, so if there are some questions, I can answer them then, and then we'll be able to get to all the remaining questions at the end. So as Jerry said, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have an urgent question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away if it's something urgent that you don't want to forget, or you can put it in the chat. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. We'll pull this up. Alrighty. So mirrorless cameras. I will go ahead and jump into this. So for starters, what is a mirrorless camera? So as an example here, we have 2 cameras, the Nikon D500 on the top and the Nikon Z7 on the bottom, DSLR on the top, digital single lens reflex, and the mirrorless on the bottom. So with the digital single lens reflex, or DSLR, the light will come in through the front lens. There'll be a mirror in the back which it reflects off of, up through the prism and out through the viewfinder. With the mirrorless camera, you are completely eliminating that mirror altogether, hence the name mirrorless camera. So in the simplest terms, it's a very simple idea by removing that mirror, and what that actually means can get a little bit more complicated and more complex, and there's some cool things that can go along with that, which was what this program is all about. But just as an example, you'll see here, if you kind of look right through the middle of the camera, you're going to have the mirror in the back where the light's going to reflect up and out the viewfinder. With the mirrorless camera, you're not going to have that. And again, that's the same across the board. All DSLRs will have that design. All mirrorless cameras will have this design where there's no mirror. The light's directly hitting the sensor and playing right back on the sensor. So why go mirrorless? Size count. So with mirrorless cameras, size is one thing that a lot of people will talk about. Size isn't always the only reason you should determine switching over to mirrorless. It's definitely one factor, but not all mirrorless cameras are automatically going to be smaller or lighter than DSLRs, which I'll touch on a little bit more going forward. But as an example here on the right-hand side, we have the Nikon D850 and the Nikon Z7, both of their flagship cameras on the mirrorless and DSLR side, both 42 megapixels. You can see that the Z7 is much smaller than the D850, and then down at the bottom we have the 5D Mark IV from Canon and the EOS R, which is now a little bit older with the new release the other day from Canon, which I will touch on in a little bit as well. But you can see the difference in size between the two of them. So fewer internal parts to take up space, so less parts that go into building that mirror box and that construction that you have on DSLRs. No optical viewfinder, which means a much less bulky prism. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see the prism on both of these DSLRs is significantly larger than the prism on both mirrorless cameras, because you're eliminating that optical viewfinder. They can make that size much smaller to be able to put an LCD screen in there, which I will get into. So, and lastly, flange distance is significantly shorter. So what is a flange distance? In the simplest terms, the flange distance is the measurement from the lens mount to the sensor plane. So with the image on the left here, you have your standard DSLR on the left, and it's the measure from, again, right where the lens mounts all the way to the sensor. With the mirrorless camera, when you eliminate that actual mirror that's in there, you can cut that in half, if not sometimes even larger, and really reduce the thickness of the camera. So typically with mirrorless cameras, they may not always be tall, or might not always be shorter or wider or whatever it may be, but generally they're going to be much thinner than DSLRs. So a lot of the early generation mirrorless cameras weren't as comfortable because they were so thin and the grip wasn't as ergonomically designed, and some people didn't find them as kind of fitting to their hands. Now a lot of mirrorless cameras are designing in a larger grip, but still taking advantage of the slimmer body, but just building up the grip a little bit. So mirrorless cameras are a lot more comfortable now. And you'll find that kind of across the board with most of the manufacturers now, that they have made the grip a little bit larger so they're more comfortable. So by reducing this flange distance, this affects almost all aspects of the camera design, and also allows for a greater choice in lens design and lens selection. Going off of lens design and lens selection, for those of you Nikon and Canon shooters, both Nikon and Canon have lens adapters that would allow you to use your DSLR lenses on their mirrorless cameras. So whether you're using the EOS R or the newly released R5 or R6 that was just announced the other day, or the Nikon Z7 or Z6 or even their Z50, they have both adapters which will allow you to use all of your SLR lenses on there. So both Nikon and Canon have tons and tons of lenses. I'm sure those of you guys who are shooting Nikon or Canon probably have a large assortment of lenses and are worried about, oh, if I switch over to mirrorless, I'm not going to be able to use my lenses. I'm going to lose quality. They're not going to perform as well. If you're using the adapters that Nikon and Canon make with Nikon lenses on a Nikon body and Canon lenses on a Canon body, you're not going to lose any quality. You're not going to lose any focus speed, anything like that. All the adapter is doing is making up for that flange distance. So it's basically putting back in the space where the mirror would have been, and also giving you electronic communications between the lens and the camera to allow it to autofocus, to allow it to meter, and all of those other things. So really, that flange distance comes back when you add on the adapter here. But as I will get into in a little bit, there are some other key features that make it worth it by switching over to a mirrorless, that you can get some new advantages and some new things that you can do with your old lenses that you weren't able to do on your DSLR. So for those of you guys shooting Nikon and Canon, you don't have to worry if you switch over to the Nikon or Canon mirrorless system, you'll still be able to use the majority of your lenses. So on top of using Nikon or Canon lenses on the Nikon or Canon mirrorless, you can also adapt on pretty much any other lens that has ever been produced. So on the right here, I've made a list of just a bunch of different lens mounts that are available to be adapted onto mirrorless cameras, whether it be Sony, Nikon, Canon, Olympus, Fuji, Panasonic, any one of them. There are companies out there making adapters for all the different types of bodies, as well as all the different types of lenses. So for me, at least, I still shoot a lot of film and have a lot of film cameras and film lenses. Some of you guys may have older film cameras lying around that you used to use, or maybe even still use, and have lenses that go along with them. With mirrorless cameras, it's very easy to buy an adapter and adapt on those lenses onto your camera. So with my camera, I'm shooting with a Sony mirrorless now and have adapters for Leica lenses, Nikon lenses, Canon FD lenses, so the older film SLR mounts, and I have a variety of different lenses that I'm able to mount on there. So there's a bunch of different lenses that you can use to mount on to kind of give some life into your old lenses, which is really cool. Or even go out to different flea markets, tag sales, things like that, and come across some of these lenses pretty cheap and be able to adapt them on. Most of these adapters, because they don't have any autofocus or any electronic communication between the camera and the lens, really it's just one mount to the other, and then making up for that flange distance. They're relatively inexpensive, anywhere between $30 to $50 for these non-autofocusing adapters. So going off of that, you're able to save your old lenses from gathering dust in the attic, or if they're sitting in a bag somewhere in your closet. You're able to use your current lenses from Nikon or Canon that you have on a more smaller and portable body. There's some specialized adapters out there which can improve the light gathering ability, and even adapters out there which will allow for autofocus with lenses that don't have autofocus built in. So another cool thing about some of these adapters is if I'm using one of my Nikon lenses that are from the 70s, it doesn't have manual focus or anything like that, there are some specialized adapters out there that will have an autofocus motor built into them, which will allow for autofocus on that lens, which was never possible prior to mirrorless cameras. So this is something that's really cool. Again, this isn't going to be the fastest focusing lens out there, or definitely the fastest focusing lens that you own. But it is cool that they have the ability to design an autofocus motor into an adapter to give you that capability. And again, there's so many different lens options out there. So if you want to adapt old lenses onto it, you're able to do that. If you want to adapt new lenses, you can do that. So there are a lot of cool adapters out there that you can get to try out different lenses that you may have laying around, or you may find out shopping at a flea market or tag sale or whatever it may be. Finding your focus. So when it comes to focusing with mirrorless cameras, earlier on, 3-4 years ago, when mirrorless cameras were starting to gain some popularity, focus was one thing that was severely lacking. The focusing wasn't really comparable to what a lot of DSLRs were doing. A lot of sports and wildlife photographers and things like that were not comfortable using mirrorless cameras because it just wasn't reliable. That's not so much the case anymore. With all the new iterations of mirrorless cameras coming out within this past year, and even the year before, the autofocus has greatly improved. So autofocusing now is just as good, if not better, than DSLR cameras. You have things like face detection and eye detection in certain cameras where it'll lock onto a face. Some cameras even have built-in animal detection. So if you're photographing birds or wildlife, it'll lock on and track that. So there are a lot of cool features that they have now in mirrorless cameras when it comes to focusing that really help you in finding your focus and locking your focus on and tracking and things like that. So a lot of people will say, oh, mirrorless cameras don't focus as well as DSLRs. And while that may have been true a number of years ago, that's not so much the case anymore. And then when you manually focus, whether you're using an old lens that doesn't have autofocus, as I was touching about prior, or you just want to use manual focus to really fine tune your focus in and make sure your focus is tack sharp and where you want it to be, there's a few different ways you can do that. So one of those, which I have an example of here on the left, is focus peaking. So what focus peaking is basically an overlay on either your viewfinder or your LCD screen in a different color, either red, green, or blue. Here it's shown in red. Red tends to be one of the more popular colors that people like to use. That's the most recognizable. And what this will give you is, once you switch into manual focus mode on your camera, this overlay will appear on whatever is in focus in your image. So as you're focusing, if you adjust the focus ring back and forth, you will see this red overlay shift from the front to the back of your image, depending on what is in focus. So right now it's completely, the spiker here in the front is completely highlighted in red. If I take the image just like this, that red overlay is not going to appear in it, and that bike rider is going to be tack sharp, and everything else will be out of focus, as you can see here. But this red overlay is showing you what's in focus. So for those of you who like doing macro photography or portraiture and really want to make sure your focus point is locked on a specific point, or you're using an old manual focus lens and it's tough to tell where your focus is, if it's truly in focus, you have the ability to turn this setting on and know very well if your focus is going to be where it needs to be or if you're off a little bit. Going off of that, there's also the ability to zoom in digitally while you're using manual focus. So wherever your focus point may be, if you have digital zoom turned on while focusing in your camera, as you start adjusting the focus ring, your camera is automatically going to jump in about 5 to 10 times, depending on the model, to where that focus point is and really lock on, so you can get a much more magnified view of what your subject or the subject that you're trying to focus. So say you're trying to photograph a flower and want to get one of the petals in focus and leave everything else blurred out. You can put that focus point on one of the petals, start to adjust the focus, and it'll automatically jump in to that area where the focus point is on, and you'll be able to really fine tune that in. And then lastly, going off fine tuning. With every DSLR that's out there, many of you may have experienced this before. Sometimes you may buy a lens, you have your focus point directly on one point, you go to review your images and it's just a little soft. It's either missing a little bit in the front or missing a little bit in the back. If you focus on the eye and have the focus point on the eye, the sharpest point of the image may be on the nose or on their ear, and it's just not focusing directly where it should be. And you may need to do something called an autofocus fine tune, where you have to go into the menu settings of your camera, adjust the focus for either front or back focusing. There are certain lenses like Sigma and Tamron, which will have docks, which will allow you to adjust those lenses as well. So sometimes in DSLRs, you will need to calibrate a lens to a body They're not going to be perfectly in sync right away. Again, that's not always the case, but I have seen that quite a few times, especially working in the store, people coming in saying, hey, I just bought this brand new lens. It's not sharp. And typically it's not because it's defective or anything like that. It's just that it needs to be adjusted to their body, excuse me. However, with the mirrorless camera, all the focusing is done directly on the sensor plane. So that focusing system is directly on the sensor plane. So wherever your focus point is going to be, that's what's going to be in sharp. There's no worry about front or back focusing. It's not even an option. With mirrorless cameras, there's no way to adjust it because there's no need to fix it. No matter what lens you use, no matter what camera you use, there's no need for autofocus fine tune or adjusting any of your lenses like you have to do sometimes with DSLRs. So this is kind of the midway point. I'll stop here to see if there's any questions. If not, I will keep on going. Jerry, if you could read them off to me, that would be great while I'm still sharing my screen.
Yeah, really the only one I think I've got so far is which cameras have the focus peaking.
Pretty much every mirrorless camera that's out there has the ability to do focus peaking. There's not any off the top of my head that don't have it, especially all the current cameras that are out right now. Maybe some of the early mirrorless cameras that came out didn't have it, but anything that's current right now that you can buy will have the ability to turn on focus peaking. It's a pretty common feature amongst all mirrorless cameras.
And I think even some of the older ones, if you did the firmware updates, some of them added it too, and I think
Yeah, so that's another thing that's nice about mirrorless cameras. They can add more features in through firmware updates. So as Jerry mentioned, you can add in focus peaking. Companies are able to do that and upgrade cameras with certain things through firmware updates. So they can improve current cameras that are already out there and improve features of the cameras that may be lacking, or the autofocus may not be right where they want it to be, or they may add in a certain feature that they may be missing. They have the ability to do that with a firmware upgrade, which is a really cool feature. So that's another thing to pay attention to. If you're already shooting a mirrorless camera and you haven't ever upgraded your firmware, it's worth checking to see what firmware you have currently loaded onto your camera, which you can find in the menu system, and then also going to that manufacturer's website and looking up to see if there's any firmware updates for your current camera. There may be some new features added in or some quirks that were worked out that are very easily accessible off of their website, and you can download and do that yourself from your own home. Or if you have a local camera store, or you're local to our store or in the area or whatever it may be, we're happy to do those adjustments as well and do firmware upgrades for people as well. So that is another thing to look out for.
Some of the lenses need firmware updates too. One of the other questions I had is, what's the difference between the EF and RF lenses?
So the main difference is the mount. So when Canon came out with their new mirrorless system, they changed the mount over from the EF mount to the RF mount. It is a little bit of a larger mount, so you can't directly mount on EF lenses. This allows for a little bit of a greater choice of lens design and how they can actually build these lenses. There's really no significant difference as far as the lenses are better quality or things like that specifically, but they need to design a new mount for this new mirrorless camera or this new mirrorless camera system, basically so it's kind of future-proof, so they can have more room and more flexibility to be a little bit more innovative with lens design and create different lenses and new lenses. I mean, they just came out with 2 new lenses, which are pretty unique, and I'm curious to check them out, which is a 600mm f11 and an 800mm f11 lens, which are very small and compact and lightweight. So different new lens designs they're able to come out with because of this new mount being a little bit larger. They can implement in different design features to these lenses.
And the one last question then is, I'm going to paraphrase this question.
Sure.
With respect from mirrorless to DSLRs, are there any negatives to the mirrorless that the DSLRs still have an advantage over them?
There are a couple things which I'll get to at the end, but not many. So I'll come back to that at the end. I actually have a slide on some of the pros and cons at the end of the program. So I will address that once I get to that point. But I will say there's not many cons in my opinion. So I will get to that within the next 15, 20 minutes here.
Okay, and the one last question that came in.
Sure.
So there really shouldn't be any image quality differences between the EF and RF lenses.
Nope. So again, you can use your EF lenses with the adapter on the new mirrorless cameras from Canon without any loss of quality. The quality will be just as good, if not better, depending on the resolution improvement of the mirrorless camera. But the lens quality will not be any worse if you're putting an EF lens on an RF mount camera like the EOS R, the RP, or the R5 and R6, which were just announced, which I'll touch on a little bit at the end after the program. And then the RF lenses, again, newer technology, so some of the lenses may have a little bit better optical quality and with the glass and things like that. But again, they do have more budget-friendly lenses, which are not going to be as good as the L series lenses that are out there for the EF mounts right now. So they are designing comparable levels of lenses in the RF mounts that they have going with their EF mount right now. So they have a few different levels of lenses, from just kind of the basic ultrasonic level to the L series. And even below that, there's just no naming convention of them. So they do have a few different quality levels, just like they did with their EF lenses that they are producing into their RF lenses as well. If that's it for now, I will continue going, so I'm not here all night with you guys and don't take up all of your time. So small size, big image. So some mirrorless cameras are the same size of a point and shoot camera. Point and shoot cameras will typically have a sensor size that is 5 to 9 times smaller than an APS-C size sensor, which is most commonly found in DSLRs, or the most common sensor across all the DSLRs that are produced, I should say. And mirrorless cameras can give you a point and shoot size camera that can have a 1/4 size sensor or larger. So I say can give you a point and shoot size sensor, or a point and shoot size camera, excuse me. There are some options out there from like Olympus and Panasonic who are micro 4/3, which is this sensor size here down on the bottom, which is exactly half the size of a full frame sensor, where their cameras are very small, compact, and lightweight. But when you're speaking about full frame mirrorless cameras, again, you're still having a full frame sensor in there. So there's really a limit as to how small you can really make these cameras to be able to fit that sensor in there, fit in a viewfinder, fit in all of the other features that go into these cameras. So most full frame cameras that are mirrorless are not going to be greatly smaller than a DSLR or a whole lot lighter, but what you will get is benefits like the focus peaking, which I touched on before, and then a few other things which I'll jump into in a couple minutes here. So size and weight, again, is not really the only reason you should be considering switching to mirrorless. There are options out there, again, from like Olympus and Panasonic that make micro 4/3 cameras that are smaller and lighter and can save you weight and can save you size if that's what you're looking to do. But mirrorless as a whole is not always going to be smaller and lighter, and especially if you're going to be switching over to something like the Canon or Nikon mirrorless system and adapting on your current lenses, you're really not going to save a ton of size or a ton of weight once you add on the adapter and you're using your old lenses. So that's one thing I do want to clarify is a lot of people will assume, oh, mirrorless cameras can be smaller, lighter, more compact. And while it can be, that's not always the case. Kind of going back to this here, again, typically with most point and shoot cameras, you're going to have a 1/2 size sensor. And then you have your smartphone sensor, which is over here to the right, which is even smaller than this. Mirrorless cameras come in all different sensor sizes, from micro 4/3, which you'll find in Olympus and Panasonic, APS-C, which you'll find in Sony, Nikon, Canon, and Fuji. APS-H is an older sensor size. You don't really see that much anymore. And then you have full frame, which you'll find in Nikon, Canon, Sony, and Panasonic is also doing some full frame mirrorless cameras now as well. And then what isn't listed here is medium format mirrorless, which Fuji has a couple offerings, and also Hasselblad has a medium format mirrorless camera as well. But most common are going to be full frame, APS-C, and micro four thirds. Again, the smaller sensor size that you go, typically the smaller system you're going to have. The lens designs can be smaller, more compact, and lightweight. So typically with Olympus and Panasonic cameras, you'll see smaller lenses being produced when you compare them to comparable DSLR size lenses or comparable full frame lenses, I should say. The lenses will be typically half the size because they don't need to be as large to cover a larger sensor area. When you're talking about full frame, whether it be mirrorless or DSLR, the lenses are going to be very similar in size and similar in weight because they need to be large enough to allow enough light in to cover that entire sensor. So that's just one thing I kind of want to clarify and get out of the way, just to clear up any misconceptions that may be out there about kind of the size and weight of mirrorless cameras as a whole. So viewfinder, another one of the key advantages, and I think one of the 3 key advantages of mirrorless cameras is the electronic viewfinder. So with the 2 images I have here, you have an example of an electronic viewfinder on the left and an overlay of an optical viewfinder on the right. So starting with the optical viewfinder, you'll have things like the grid, so you can line up your rule of thirds and things like that. You'll have your different focus points so you can see where your focus is going to be. And then you'll have some basic settings down at the bottom, like your exposure mode, the shutter speed you're shooting at, your metering, how many images you have left, your ISO, things like that. With an electronic viewfinder, you're going to have all that plus more. You can see things like battery life, what image quality you're shooting at, how many images you have left on your card, what video mode you may be shooting in. You're going to get all the same basic information at the bottom: your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, your meter, your exposure compensation. All these different settings that you have the ability to control, you have the option to overlay them on that electronic viewfinder. Now, if you don't want to see them, you also have the ability to turn all of that off, so there's no distractions when you're looking through the viewfinder. So you have more available shooting info. Another thing that you can do with an electronic viewfinder is overlay a live histogram, so you can make sure you're not clipping on your highlights or clipping on your shadows, and your image isn't going to be overexposed or underexposed, and you're going to be losing information either in the highlights or in the shadows. You have the ability to shoot video through the viewfinder, so if it's a really bright sunny day out and you're outside and there's really no shade and you can't see the back LCD screen, you're trying to record video and there's a lot of glare on the screen, you can't see it, you have the ability to shoot video looking through the viewfinder, which will block out all that glare. You can't do that with a DSLR camera because when you're shooting video, that mirror will lock up, so all the light can actually be projected directly onto the sensor, and as soon as that mirror locks up, it blocks all the light coming out of the viewfinder and it's blacked out. You don't have that with a DSLR camera, so you can shoot video through the viewfinder, which is a really cool feature for those of you who like doing video. You also have the ability to overlay a digital level, so you can make sure your image is straight if you're doing landscape photography or anything like that. Another really big key feature is being able to see your exposure and depth of field in real time. So when you look through an optical viewfinder, if you're in a dark room, you look through the viewfinder, it's going to appear dark. No matter what your settings are, no matter what you have set on the camera, it's going to look dark through the viewfinder. Sure, you'll have your meter at the bottom to see if you're under or overexposed, but you're really not going to get a true idea of what that image is going to look like until you actually press the shutter and go back to the playback and review the image to see what the exposure really looks like. With an electronic viewfinder, you'll be able to see that exposure in real time through the electronic viewfinder. So before you even take the image, you'll have a good idea of what the image is going to look like. And you'll be able to see, okay, this is the exposure I want. It's not overexposed, it's not underexposed. You'll be able to see that in real time. And as you adjust the shutter speed, as you adjust your ISO, as you adjust your aperture, you'll see the image get brighter and darker in the viewfinder. So you can see, again, all of this in real time. You don't have to take an extra second to go back, review your images, make sure the exposure is correct, and then go back and change a couple settings around. You can change everything while you're looking through the viewfinder and see your exposure in real time. You also have the ability to see your depth of field in real time as well. So if you're doing portraiture and want to blur out the background, or doing macro and want to blur out the background, you'll be able to see that in real time through the viewfinder as well. So again, you can preview exactly what your image is going to look like before you even take it, which is really great. More useful info for manual focus. So as I had touched on before, you have the ability to use the focus peaking and then also ability to digitally zoom in to lock in your focus much better. And then no viewfinder blackout for some models. So for those of you shooting wildlife or sports or shooting bursts, you know when you shoot those bursts, the DSLR, whenever that mirror flips up to allow the light to expose onto the sensor, it's going to black out the viewfinder for a split second, and you're not really seeing the exact moment that image is being captured. So if you're trying to follow and track something, it may be a little bit harder because the viewfinder keeps blacking out every time you take an image. With some mirrorless camera models, you don't have that. Some mirrorless camera models out there have no viewfinder blackout, so as you're shooting a burst, you see the whole time the image. Nothing is going to black out, so you can follow and track a moving subject, whether it be a bird or a sports player running around. You can follow and track them much easier without any risk of the viewfinder blacking out and you possibly missing the shot or anything like that. So that's another cool feature which you have with an electronic viewfinder that you don't have with an optical viewfinder. And another big key feature, in-body stabilization. This is something completely new to mirrorless cameras. This is not something that was ever implemented into DSLRs. They didn't have the ability to put in-body stabilization in DSLR cameras. And again, this is another key factor as to why mirrorless is becoming so popular and why so many vendors are switching over all their efforts into mirrorless and coming out with all these new mirrorless cameras and lenses. And while there's so much talk and excitement about it right now, in-body stabilization is an amazing addition to cameras, which can help out in many different aspects. So here is just kind of a general graph of what in-body stabilization is. Typically, in-body stabilization is classified as a 5-axis image stabilization. The sensor is actually on a 5-axis gimbal or gyro sitting inside the body, so it can compensate for any movement up, down, left, right, roll, shake, any way you move the camera. The sensor is on a gyro that's going to compensate for that. So what that actually means is you have the ability to stabilize all of your lenses, new or old. So as I was mentioning before, I use a lot of older lenses that don't have manual focus and definitely don't have image stabilization. With the mirrorless camera that has in-body stabilization, I now have a stabilized lens. With that being said, there's also lenses out there that already have built-in image stabilization in them. And there are certain camera models in lens combinations where you can actually improve the image stabilization that you get when you use an in-body stabilized camera and an image stabilized lens together. You'll get even greater stabilization. So kind of an example of how this works. Image stabilization is classified in numbers of stops. So for this example, the camera has 4 stops of image stabilization, which means you should be able to make the shutter speed 4 stops longer than the average guideline. So many of you may already know this, but typically the average guideline for the slowest shutter speed you would want to use is 1 over the focal length. So if we're using a 50mm lens, typically the slowest shutter speed you would want to shoot at is 1/50th. Anything below that may cause a risk of some blur or some out of focus images. Again, take that with a grain of salt. Some people have more steadier hands, some people don't have as steady hands. But as a good rule of thumb, 1 over the focal length is typically the slowest shutter speed you'll want to shoot with. So for this instance, we're using a 50mm lens, so we don't want to shoot below 1/50th of a second. If I am using a 50mm lens on a image stabilized camera that has 4 stops of image stabilization, that will allow us to shoot all the way down to 1/4 of a second. So 4 stops slower than 1/50th, and you'll get an image that is just as sharp as if you were shooting it at 1/50th of a second when you have 4 stops of in-body stabilization. So this can open up a whole lot of different things and really eliminate the need for a tripod in many situations. So if you're doing night photography or you're doing longer exposures, you can eliminate the need for a tripod in several of these situations. Sure, you're not going to be able to hand hold it for 30 seconds or several minutes or anything like that, but 1-2 seconds, sure. There are some camera models out there, specifically, which I have listed down here, the Olympus EM1 Mark III, paired with the 12 to 100mm lens, can have up to 7.5 stops of image stabilization. So you can shoot down to 2 or 3 second long exposures and get a stable image, which is pretty much unheard of no matter who you are using a DSLR camera. So again, that's another key factor. Not every mirrorless camera out there will have in-body stabilization. So if you're out there looking to get a mirrorless camera or seeing what options are out there, not every camera has in-body stabilization that's mirrorless. But as more cameras are coming out, it is a feature that is being implemented into a lot of them. So if you have questions about specific models, if they have it or not, feel free to ask a question now or after the program to me. If you're looking at a specific model and are unsure, I'd be glad to help you out and let you know whether it does or not and how many stops of image stabilization that that camera may or may not
There are a couple.
have.
One of the questions is, how's the Olympus compared to the Canon?
As far as stabilization or just
Correct.
kind of as a whole? So the Olympus cameras have some of the best stabilization across the board for mirrorless cameras. They were one of the first manufacturers to actually implement it into their camera design and have taken it now all the way up to 7.5 stops with their new EM1 Mark III. Typically, the average is kind of around 4 or 5 stops with most cameras that are out there. That's kind of the average number you'll see. 7.5 is kind of crazy. I'm curious to see as time goes on if that number is going to keep going up and you'll be able to handhold cameras for 10, 15 seconds and basically eliminate the need for tripods as a whole. But as it is right now, Olympus is probably leading the way when it comes to image stabilization as far as how many stops they have, as they were one of the first ones to kind of implement it into their camera designs. Most cameras will have around 4 or 5 stops that do have image stabilization built into them, however.
I can tell you, it just floors me what I can hold, especially with the longer lenses.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the back to the viewfinder on most of the cameras, is there much of a difference, or can you tailor the difference between what you're looking through at the back versus the viewfinder on the mirrorless?
As far as like the quality goes?
No, just what's on the image.
So like sharpness and like clarity, or?
No, the different icons and things that are there.
Oh, so like the feature. So if I go back,
Right.
so like all the different things.
Right.
So what you can customize, you mean, is that what you're saying? Sorry.
Yeah. Is there much difference between what you see through the viewfinder versus looking at the back in terms of all the different?
It's basically the same. So you can see this either on the back LCD screen or you can see it through the viewfinder. It's basically just taking it from the LCD screen and then just displaying that image in the viewfinder. So it's basically the same information that you would see on your digital, or not your digital, excuse me, but on your rear LCD screen. You'd be able to see all that information in the viewfinder as well. And then again, you have the ability to kind of turn all of that off if you don't want to see it, if it's distracting in both the viewfinder and the rear LCD screen. You can turn all of this extra stuff off. There's typically a display mode or a display button on most cameras, which will cycle through those different display modes. Some will give you a level, some will give you just the focusing points that you have, some will give you everything. So you can cycle through the different display modes in both the viewfinder and the rear LCD screen.
A couple more quickies.
Sure.
In terms of the sensors, is there really much difference between the mirrorless and the mirror or the DSLRs in terms of image, like sensor sensitivity and noise?
Not really. I mean, sensor designs are constantly improving. There's no significant differences just because they're in a mirrorless camera. Again, sensor technology is always going to continuously improve as time goes on. I mean, even the past 5 years, it's amazing to see how far the technology has come. In my little over 4 years now at Hunts, how much things have changed in that time. So there's nothing specifically that'll make the sensor better just because it's on a mirrorless camera. But again, as time goes on, you'll be seeing more mirrorless cameras and more design innovation going into those. And I think you'll start to see less design innovation going into DSLRs, if any, within the next couple of years. I think Nikon and Canon are really shifting their efforts to focus on building up their mirrorless system and improving their mirrorless system. Again, because of all these different features and attributes that you have that you just can't design and implement into DSLR cameras. So Yes, sensor technology is getting better, but that's not just because it's in a mirrorless camera. It's just getting better as time goes on.
And one last question in terms of, will you be talking about battery life?
I will touch on it in like 2 or 3 slides.
Okay,
So yes, I will touch on that.
great, thanks.
Of course.
You're good.
Alrighty, so I think this is where we left off. So I think we finished the slide, but again, in-body stabilization, a really big key feature in a lot of mirrorless cameras. So if you are looking to get a mirrorless camera, I would definitely look for one that has it built in already. Again, a lot of the newer models coming out now do have it built in, but there are still some out there on the market that you can still purchase new that don't have in-body stabilization. So that is one key feature that I would look for if you are looking to switch over to mirrorless or even upgrade a current mirrorless camera that you already have, because it can help you out in a lot of different situations. Again, even if you're not shooting at night or anything like that, as Jerry mentioned, holding long lenses. Again, if you're using a 150 to 600 millimeter lens, I know that's a very popular lens with a lot of wildlife and sports photographers. Typically, you don't want to shoot that below 1/500th of a second or 1/600th of a second, because you may risk getting a little bit of shake and blurriness. With in-body stabilization, you can drop that shutter speed down lower and be able to hand hold larger lenses at a lower shutter speed. So not just applicable for night photography or long exposures, but also just slowing down your shutter speed a little bit more with larger glass. So getting into the players, who's actually making mirrorless cameras these days, and the answer is everybody. Every camera manufacturer out there has one mirrorless camera one way or another. So starting off, you have Nikon and Canon, the Nikon Z7, which is their flagship, and the Canon EOS R, which I need to change over to the R5 now, which is the new flagship, which was just announced last week. Sony and Fuji, the Sony A7 series, and then the brand new Fuji X-T4. Then we're jumping over to Panasonic and Olympus, the OM1 series from Panasonic, and then this is the full frame series from Panasonic that is the S series, but they also do have cameras that are micro four thirds. So kind of jumping back to this real quick. So Nikon and Canon, again, both of these are full frame, but they do have APS-C size centered cameras as well that have the same mount. So Nikon has their Z series mount and Canon has the RF mount, and both full frame and APS-C. They have the Sony A7 series, which is all full frame. And then you also have the A6000 series, which is their APS-C version. Again, that's on the Sony E mount. Fuji is mainly just focusing on the APS-C size sensor. They don't have any full frame options. That's all on the Fuji X mount. And then they do also have the mirrorless medium format, which I don't really go into much detail on in here, but they do have that as an option, the mirrorless medium format, which is pretty cool as well. And then lastly, again, Panasonic and Olympus with micro four thirds, and their OM series. And then you have Panasonic over here on the right with their full frame S series. And then they also have their micro four thirds size cameras, which will share the mount with Olympus. So are they better than a DSLR? And this is kind of that pros and cons page that I was talking about. So mirrorless cameras are different. They're not always better. There are a lot of things that are better. Some of those things are, they can be smaller and lighter. So as I was kind of mentioning before, just because it's a mirrorless camera does not always mean it's going to be smaller and lighter and more compact and save you a ton of weight from carrying it around. Again, there are options out there like Olympus and Panasonic with the micro four thirds size system where you can really save a lot of size and weight. But that's not always the case with every mirrorless camera that's out there. Equal quality, image quality, or equal image quality to a comparable DSLR, excuse me. So image quality is going to be just as good, if not better than the DSLRs that are out there. So for instance, you have the Nikon Z7 and the Nikon D850, same 42 megapixel sensor. Just because it's in a mirrorless camera doesn't mean there's going to be any loss of quality or anything like that. If anything, it's going to be improved technology. So image size and image sensor quality is going to be very comparable to a similar image size and sensor in DSLRs. You have a huge support of legacy lenses from both Nikon and Canon. Again, so for those of you Nikon and Canon shooters out there, you have the ability to adapt over pretty much all of your lenses over to the new system. That's not to say every lens will work. There are some lenses that will either not mount if it's like an older generation lens, or some APS-C size lenses may mount onto the mirrorless full frame cameras, but you may lose some image quality because they're going to crop in to compensate for that. But for the most part, you can mount the majority of the EF and F mount lenses from both Nikon and Canon onto mirrorless cameras. And again, both Nikon and Canon have lists on their website of all the compatible lenses that will work with their new mirrorless system. So if you want to go and do a little bit more research just to make sure the lenses you have will work, feel free to check out those lists. You can very easily find it on their website, or shoot me an email if you're just curious. If you have a couple of lenses that you're not sure if they'll work or not, I'll be more than happy to answer those for you guys. So again, most of them will work with no loss of quality or any compromise at all. Again, ability to adapt lenses from different manufacturers. So just because you're shooting Nikon or Canon, you don't have to automatically use Nikon or Canon lenses. You can adapt on other lenses from older Pentax, or put a Canon lens on a Nikon camera or a Nikon lens on a Canon camera. For me, I shoot Sony, and I've put all different types of lenses on it, from Canon to older Nikon lenses to Leica M mount lenses to Canon FD. Again, you could use pretty much any lens that's out there. There's probably an adapter being made that will allow you to adapt it onto your mirrorless camera. The in-body stabilization, which we had just talked about, which I think is one of the biggest deciding factors as to why to switch to mirrorless, and one of the biggest things and the largest advantages that you get with the mirrorless camera. The electronic viewfinder, a lot more options than you get with an optical viewfinder. And also, which I'll touch on quickly, is the ability for silent shooting with an electronic shutter. So many mirrorless cameras out there have the ability to use an electronic shutter, which will allow for completely silent shooting. So if you're shooting indoors in a church or at a wedding or whatever it may be, and want to make sure you're being completely silent, you don't want to disturb what's going on. Maybe even if you're doing some wildlife photography in a very quiet area and don't want to scare away the animal or whatever it may be, you have the ability in many mirrorless cameras now to turn on silent shooting, where there won't be any sound whatsoever that the camera will make, which is really cool, which you don't have the ability for in DSLRs. So jumping into some of the cons, I know Jerry was asking, are there any kind of negatives that go along with mirrorless cameras? And there are a few, but not many. Smaller native lens system. So if you're a Nikon or Canon shooter, they don't have as many native lenses out right now for that Z mount or that RF mount. Canon did just announce several more the other day, and have a roadmap for the rest of this year and even into next year with a lot of new lenses coming out for that. Same thing with Nikon. They have a handful of lenses out right now, but do have a larger roadmap for the next 2 years of a larger selection of lenses coming out, which I know Mike will touch on in his program as well, about some of those different models. So again, even though they don't have the largest native lens selection, you can adapt on your old lenses. And then there's companies like Sony, like Fuji, and Olympus and Panasonic, which have been making mirrorless cameras now for quite a number of years. And they do have a good selection of lenses out there. And then again, you have the ability to adapt on different lenses as well. Electronic viewfinder is not to everybody's liking. Even though there are so many advantages to electronic viewfinders, it can be a little bit of an adjustment to get used to. Your eye is very accustomed to looking through an optical viewfinder. It's like looking through a window. What you see through the window, if it's dark, it's dark. What you see through an optical viewfinder, it's just kind of more comfortable for your eye. You're not looking at an LCD screen like you are with an electronic viewfinder. So it does take a little bit of an adjustment to get used to. I know it did for me when I switched over to mirrorless a couple of years back. It did take a little bit of time to get used to and get your eye adjusted to it. But another nice thing about the electronic viewfinders is early on, a lot of the electronic viewfinders were not very good. The resolution was very poor. There was a lot of lag and delay with them. That's really not the case anymore. The electronic viewfinders, the quality in them is really amazing now. There's really no lag or delay at all. So they are a lot more comfortable to look through now. But again, they do still take a little bit of an adjustment, and it's not to everybody's liking. So something that it's worth if you haven't tried out for yourself already, borrowing a friend's camera, going into a camera store if you have one locally, or whatever it may be, just see what that's going to be like, because it is a different experience than using an optical viewfinder. Autofocus performance can vary a little bit, but has greatly improved over the years. So as I was touching on earlier, several years ago, the autofocus in a lot of mirrorless cameras really wasn't on par with what a lot of DSLRs were doing. Not really so much the case anymore with all the current cameras that are out there. Again, there are some older models that may be lacking in focus a little bit, but pretty much every new camera that's coming out now and has come out within the past year or so really has amazing autofocus performance. And as I was talking about earlier, with firmware upgrades, companies have the ability to improve the autofocus. So for instance, Sony, maybe a year ago now or somewhere around there, came out with a firmware upgrade which implemented in animal tracking. So that was an update that didn't originally come out with the camera. So when you bought the camera, that feature wasn't in there. But with this firmware upgrade, they were able to add that into the camera. So a completely new feature, and that was able to improve the performance of the camera for those people shooting wildlife or even their pets at home. So again, with mirrorless, there is the ability for manufacturers to upgrade the cameras even more with firmware upgrades. And then lastly, battery life. I know there was a question on battery life a couple minutes ago. Battery life is something that was limiting and still is to some respects, but battery life has greatly improved, just like the autofocus has greatly improved as time has gone on. Early on when mirrorless cameras came out, just kind of save on size and weight, some manufacturers did put in smaller batteries, which led to poor battery performance. Now with newer camera bodies that are out there, the cameras have better power saving capabilities, and they do have larger batteries. So the battery life has gotten better. But again, you are still using an electronic viewfinder, which will draw more power than an optical viewfinder does. So on average, the battery life isn't always going to be as good as DSLRs that are out there, but it has gotten significantly better. And as time goes on, again, it's only going to keep improving. So again, pretty much every new camera coming out right now has pretty decent battery performance. It's a thing to be mindful of. You may need an extra battery or two than you're used to carrying just to be safe, but battery life is improving as time goes on and has gotten significantly better over the past several years. So that was the last slide that I had in my program. The last one here is just my contact information. I know I kind of went over a lot of information the past 45 minutes or so here. Again, I'll be answering some more questions in a minute. But if anything comes up tonight or tomorrow or in the coming week that you forgot to ask, or you have some more questions, or you want to set up a phone call with me and talk about different mirrorless options or whatever it may be, please do send me an email. I have that listed here. Reach out to me anytime with whatever it may be. If you're looking to switch over to mirrorless and don't know the best way to go, if you have more questions, I'm more than happy to answer them for you. Our website, which is just huntsphoto.com, and then our Facebook page if you guys want to keep up with everything that we have going on. We have started doing some online classes over the past several months now. So those have been really popular. And yeah, so I will leave it on this page for a second here while I answer some questions, just in case you guys want to take that information down and reach out to me with any questions that you may have. Jerry, if there's any other questions that have come in.
Yeah, we've actually got quite a few. The other thing too is, Noah, I'll try to send your contact information out to the folks in the club that participated tonight, so I'll do that for you.
Sure. I'll send you an email as well afterwards, just with a kind of a thank you and like a little follow-up thing, if you can include that, if that would be all right with you.
Okay. One of the questions, we've got stabilization. You can have either lens or body. Mm-hmm. And you can use a non-stabilized lens on a stabilized body and get some benefit of it, but is the converse true? Can you use a stabilized lens on a non-stabilized body and get any benefit out of that?
Well, yes. So that's what you have right now in pretty much most DSLRs. So every DSLR that's out there right now does not have in-body stabilization. It's not a feature that's designed into DSLRs, but there are a lot of lenses out there for those cameras that have stabilization. I don't think the stabilization in those lenses is quite as good as the stabilization that you can get in body with mirrorless cameras, but it will definitely give you some advantages and some benefit versus not having any stabilization at all. But again, on the polar opposite of that, you can use an in-body stabilized camera and a stabilized lens and greatly improve your ability to hand hold the camera at a lower shutter speed. So yes, even though there are some mirrorless cameras out there that don't have in-body stabilization, you can certainly still use a stabilized lens and get better hand holdability. But again, for most cameras that are out right now and most cameras that are coming out, they are implementing that into them. And if it's something that you're looking to switch over to, if you're looking to get a mirrorless camera, it's something I would definitely consider looking to have that feature in the camera that you get. I think it is really something that can help, again, across all aspects of photography, whatever it may be that you do.
You can get a micro four thirds adapter for Canon lenses to go, I believe, to go to like Olympus or
you can. Yep.
The Lumix or whatever. But how does that quality then compare for the standard Canon lenses versus the native lenses for those bodies?
Sure. So, I mean, you can definitely adapt on Canon lenses and some Nikon lenses. You may not have autofocus performance at all, or the autofocus performance you may have may not be very good. As again, with Nikon and Canon, they are the ones specifically manufacturing those adapters so that they can use the older EF lenses or the older f-mount lenses on the newer mirrorless cameras. And they've designed it so that there's no loss of quality or low loss of performance. Typically, when you're putting a different manufacturer's lens onto a camera body, it's not manufactured by either one of those manufacturers. So whoever is manufacturing that adapter is kind of backwards designing it, so it may not be perfect. So autofocus may not be what you would come to expect with a native lens. Shouldn't really have any loss of quality. Again, with most of these adapters, there's really no glass in them. It's just, again, the space is just air, the space that you would make up for the flange distance where the mirror was, so they focus properly. Without doing that, if you were just to try to mount on a Canon DSLR lens onto a Canon mirrorless camera and just mount it on right away, without the use of that adapter, it wouldn't focus because that lens was designed to be a certain distance away from the sensor to be able to focus properly. And if you put it closer, the camera's not going to know how to react or how that's going to work, and it just won't focus at all. So really all these adapters are doing is making up for that space so that they'll focus properly, and also giving it electronics to communicate from the lens through the camera. So when adapting on third-party lenses onto a different camera body, the performance may not be as good as what you would expect because it is coming from a third-party manufacturer making these adapters.
Gotcha. So here's one that's interesting. Canon and others say that the smaller megapixel sensors do a better job of handling noise than some of the higher megapixels. So the Sony A7R4 with the 61 megapixel is that a noisy sensor, or how high can you go in the ISO?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, kind of as a rule of thumb, typically the lower resolution you have, the better noise performance you can get. But if you're using a camera that's, I don't know, let's say 10 years old and has 20 megapixels, and you're using a brand new camera today that has 16 megapixels, the camera that's brand new that has 16 megapixels is going to greatly outperform the camera that's 10 years old and has 20 megapixels. You can shoot at a much higher ISO with the newer camera, even though it has less resolution. But kind of as a rule of thumb, yeah, lower resolution will typically equate to better low light performance. But again, sensor technology and design is another thing to factor in. That newer sensor technology and design can also equate to better low light performance. The A7R4 definitely performs very well in low light. I myself have an A7R2, which is quite a few years old now, and 2 generations back from the newest one that's out. I'm able to shoot that up to 8,000 ISO without any issues, and that's 42 megapixels. And I've used the A7R for a little bit. I haven't really pushed it to any extreme, but I would see no problem being able to shoot up to 8,000 ISO and get usable images, even maybe higher than that. But Sony also does have a camera out there, which is the A7S II, which is also quite a few years older, but that camera came out and was really a low light performing camera, and it was really designed for shooting in low light. A lot of night sky photographers liked using that camera, and that I believe had 12 megapixels. Don't quote me on that, but I think it had 12 megapixels. And again, with that, by reducing the resolution count, they can improve the low light capabilities. But again, that's just kind of a rule of thumb. That doesn't always mean that a lower resolution camera is going to have better noise performance. It doesn't always mean a higher resolution camera is going to have less noise performance. Pretty much every camera that's coming out these days has really amazing noise performance. You can shoot them at really high ISOs without really having any loss in image quality, no matter what the resolution is.
Okay, well, I'll try to get through these quick.
Sure.
You said there are three major key advantages to a mirrorless. What were those three again?
So the electronic viewfinder being one of the major ones, the in-body stabilization being another one, and then the adaptability, in my opinion, is the third. You have the ability to adapt on all these different lenses and use a lot, if you're again using Nikon or Canon, adapt on all of your EF and F mount lenses. So in my opinion, those are the three biggest factors when it comes to mirrorless: are the advantages of the electronic viewfinder, the in-body stabilization, and the adaptability that you have. I left off size and weight on that because, again, not all mirrorless cameras are smaller and lighter. If you're shooting with something like Olympus or Panasonic, you could add size and weight onto that list. That could definitely be a benefit. But kind of, again, for similarities across the board, in-body stabilization, the electronic viewfinder, and the adaptability, I think, are the three biggest factors that make mirrorless cameras so popular.
And I think the last one would be would you recommend shutting off the image stabilization when you're working on a tripod?
I would, yeah. Some cameras will automatically recognize that you're on a tripod and shut it off, but again, just like you would use an image stabilized lens on a tripod, typically you want to turn that off. It could counteract the stabilization and actually make for a blurry image. So you do have the ability to turn the in-body stabilization off in the cameras as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. No, I know you're going to let John and Mike talk for a minute, and then.
So I will exit out of here. Again, thank everybody. Thank you all for coming on. Again, if you have more questions, we'll jump back to some more questions at the end after John and Mike speak as well. Oh, future of Olympus. I saw that just came into the chat. So I will touch on that briefly. I'll start off by saying I don't know a whole lot, really not a whole lot more than the information that's already out there on the internet and on all these news posts and everything going on. It is true that Olympus did sell their camera division to a Japanese company. So that is definitely true. These aren't rumors or anything like that. What that specifically means is, in some ways, up in the air right now, at least for the rest of the year. The roadmap that Nikon has out is going to be continually coming out. So for those Olympus shooters, there is a new 150 to 400 millimeter lens that's been rumored for a while that's coming out, I believe, in the next couple of months. And there are a couple other products coming out through the rest of this year. What this means for the long term is still kind of not really known. With this new ownership, there will still be production of cameras and lenses. From the things that I'm reading, I think the Olympus name, when it comes to the cameras, may go away, is what people are talking about. So for the long term, it's really tough to say right now what the future of Olympus is going to look like, and if the quality is still going to be the same, and if the service and things like that are still going to be the same, and all of that. So again, I think that will come with time. There's no real set answer to that question as to what the future holds. I wish I could tell you that Olympus is going to be around for another 20 years or even 5-10 years, but I can't specifically say that because I don't know, and I don't even think Olympus themselves knows. Again, my rep who I speak to on a pretty regular basis, says they are continuing moving forward. The new company will still be producing cameras and lenses. But again, all the design and manufacturing and all of that is going to be under a new management, under a completely new company. So as far as the quality, it's really tough to say what that's going to look like for the long term.
Okay. Again, one of the things I heard is that this
Sure.
company sort of that purchased it, sort of their thing is to restructure the things they buy for resale.
Yeah.
So there's rumors about other camera companies maybe being, lining up to buy Olympus, but to wait and see. So one other quick question is, if you have two different products that have, like in two different brands, have lens stabilization versus body stabilization, do you need to turn one of those off to make sure that they don't fight each other?
Nope. There shouldn't be any issues with that. There wouldn't be any kind of fighting between the two of them. So if you have lens and body stabilization, or a stabilized lens, I should say, on a stabilized camera, they wouldn't fight each other, and there wouldn't be any need to turn one or the other off to compensate for anything.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Noah. And
Yeah.
who are you going to turn it over to, Don or John or Mike first?
Whoever would like to go first. I know they typically like to switch off sometimes, so I will leave it up to them.
John, go ahead.
Oh, John, I think you're still muted. There you go.
I went first last time, so you're welcome to go, Mike.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, so guys, thank you for taking some time out with us. I am with Nikon. I have been, in one way or another, in the industry since about 1984. I started when I was like 15 years old, working at a camera store in Florida, actually, in Miami. And I've been with Nikon now for 18 years, and it's actually been very fascinating and fun, the transition from film to digital. So I'm just going to add to some of the comments and things that Noah mentioned before and explain to you what our philosophy is going into creating a mirrorless system. Because like Canon, we had a very, very strong stable of DSLR cameras that were basically class leading. When you look at a sporting event, when you look at the Olympics, when you look at NASA flights, and DSLRs are still being used across the board. So there was nothing really per se wrong with the DSLR, but at the same time, there was newer technology in mirrorless that we wanted to take advantage of. And what we did is that we decided to use the mirrorless system as a catalyst to kind of almost reinvent ourselves, reinvent the mount, the F mount. And that's kind of the story that I want to explain to you guys. So I'm going to just share my screen, and if somebody can give me a thumbs up when they finally see it, would be great.
We see it.
We're good.
Awesome. Okay, so let me go to full screen. Oops. Oh, now you saw the whole presentation. There you go. Hold on. There we go. All right. So when we came out with the Z camera, the Z mount, we basically wanted to reinvent mirrorless. And I mean, that sounds silly. How do you reinvent mirrorless? And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. As I mentioned before, we had an incredible legacy. The F mount has been around for years and years, basically actually about 61 years to be exact. And we wanted to take the advantages of a DSLR and the advantages of a mirrorless. Noah did a fantastic job of basically explaining what the differences are and what the strengths are of each different type of format. Mirrorless definitely has an advantage. All things being equal, mirrorless has an advantage that it can generally be a smaller footprint, a smaller platform, and a lighter package. It's also definitely a platform, a better platform for video. Now, I realize that a lot of folks, and especially in many of the camera clubs, don't like to do video. But I would tell you that in a mirrorless system, it is so easy. You literally pick it up, hold it up to your eye, and I mean, just record. I would tell you guys to really experiment with that, especially if you guys are into birding or animals. Doing some slow motion videography with that is absolutely, it's fantastic. I would tell you to try that with whatever mirrorless camera you have. The EVF advantage, the faster frame rates. So since you don't have a mirror flapping up and down, you can eliminate that mirror box and you can shoot at a faster frame rate. So you have cameras that are shooting instead of 6 or 8 frames per second or 10 frames per second. Now you have cameras that are shooting 10, 12, 20, 40 frames per second up to. And last but not least, Noah mentioned this as well, which is the totally silent shooting. If you're shooting a baptism, a wedding, I mean, if you're an event photographer, to be completely silent and not being drawing attention to your shooting technique, that's huge. If you're shooting outdoors or in a museum and you don't want to draw attention, again, total silent shooting is a fantastic option, and I use it quite a bit. But in a DSLR, there's definite advantages that we have grown used to. The ergonomics is being one of the biggest ones, especially if you're using longer glass. The ergonomics of being able to hold that camera and steady and have a nice grip, a nice solid grip, has been missing in many mirrorless systems. And what you'll notice is if you look at version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4 of many mirrorless manufacturers, their cameras have progressively gotten larger and larger and larger, and the grip has gotten bigger, bigger, and bigger. And the reason why is because ergonomics are ergonomics. You can't fight that. I mean, you can make it as small as possible and make it uncomfortable, or you can make it somewhere in between and have nice ergonomics where you can, get a good grip of the camera and it feels comfortable when you're carrying it around all day long. DSLR cameras also generally have far better weather shielding. There's a reason that, for instance, NASA since 1971 and all of the space flights have been using Nikon DSLRs, and it's because of the weather shielding that they have. The construction, the magnesium alloy bodies, all of these things, they're able to control temperatures a lot better. So that was one of the advantages to a DSLR camera. The optical viewfinder, a lot of people like that, and the trusted performance of a DSLR. They last. They, you can go and shoot a National Geographic event, a wedding, a football game, knock somebody on the head with the camera in defense, and still keep on shooting. I mean, that was one of the things that a DSLR, especially some of the higher DSLRs, had the advantage of. So we wanted to bridge both of those features. And that's where we came up with the ideal mirrorless. Now, I mentioned that we had a legacy of a camera. So we wanted to reinvent ourselves when we came out with a mirrorless camera by creating a much larger mount. And I will go further into why a larger mount makes sense, why we wanted to do that. So I mentioned that the F mount, the Nikon F mount, has been around since 1959. And that was the first F camera that Nikon made, which was, I don't know if you guys can see my screen, but this guy right here was the first. This one's actually from 1961, but it's same camera. And that F mount, which was a fully mechanical mount, over the years, Nikon, with their research and development, has been able to put autofocus into it, put continuous tracking into it. I mean, all of these things, taken a mechanical mount and made it into what we have today with the Nikon F mount, where we have over 100 lenses in our stable right now of autofocus lenses that you can use in the Nikon F mount, and over 363 lenses that you can use since 1959 now. But in 2018, when we came out with the Z mount, we decided to go with a completely different mount. And I can tell you for a fact that it was an internal fight, or a struggle, I should say, between the research and development department and the marketing department as to, what do you mean that we're going to change the mount? Because obviously we have, if you can see right here on the screen, over 100 million F-mount lenses sold since 1959. So to change the mount now, I mean, sounded like lunacy. But there's definite advantages to changing the mount. One is light. Remember, folks, there was a question before about, the megapixels. Why a lower megapixel camera, it does better in low light. Remember that light is everything when you're taking images. So the reason that a lower megapixel sensor can do better in low light is because the pixels, since you have less pixels, the pixels can be larger. So each pixel, size-wise, is larger. So it's getting more light. The larger the lens mount, more light. The larger the window in your living room is, the more light into your living room. So, I mean, it only makes sense. So there are definite advantages to a larger mount. Another thing that we wanted to do was change the back flange distance. The back flange distance, and Noah touched upon this, is the distance between the sensor and the lens, where the lens ends. Okay? The shorter that distance, the better that you can correct and control light. The shorter that distance, the better that you can adapt other lenses, whether it be Nikon lenses, like I mentioned before. On a Nikon Z camera, you can adapt 363 different lenses onto that existing Nikon lenses onto that Z camera, because how short that back flange distance is. It is right now the most adaptable lens mount on the market because it's got the shortest back flange distance. But not only that, remember that I used the analogy of a window in your living room. So let's say you have the window open and light's coming in. It's a bright sunny day, but you're standing all the way at the back of the room. You're going to get lit. You're going to be illuminated, but you're in the back of the room, so you're not getting full direct light. So the closer you are to that window, the more that you're going to be evenly illuminated. So this allows us to create better optical designs that are going to evenly illuminate from center to edge the sensor. So we went from originally having a 46.5 mm back flange distance, now down to a 16 mm back flange distance. So we went from the smallest lens mount in the industry back from 1959 to the largest lens mount in the industry. We went from the longest back flange distance in the industry to the shortest back flange distance in the industry. What this is allowing us is, in the past, Nikon lenses, we did have some 1.2 lenses back in the film days, but if you'll notice in the digital era, the largest opening that we had in our lenses was 1.4, where, for instance, Canon had 1.2 lenses available. And the reason why was because of the back flange distance and because of the lens opening. Now, we can adapt lenses that go all the way to 0.95, so even wider than 1.2. So what it's doing is the sensor is actually receiving 100% more light approximately than it did in the previous F-mount era, which allows us, again, to correct for chromatic aberrations, give us better center to edge sharpness, better contrast, better tonal gradation, all of the above. So we wanted to incorporate, again, all of the feature set of a DSLR, but move our cameras into the 21st century or for the next 100 years, because Nikon's been in business as an optical manufacturer for over 100 years. In fact, we're going to be celebrating on the 25th our 102nd year of being an optical manufacturer. Another advantage to having a larger lens mount, getting more light to evenly illuminate the sensor, is that now, in the past, the rule of thumb is that if you've got a 2.8 lens, you basically have to stop down that lens to f4, to f5.6 to hit that sweet spot of the lens, the sharpest part of the lens. With the new mount, we're able to take lenses like a 1.8, and it will perform as well for the most part, to stopping it down to 2.8 or f4. And like I mentioned before, also allow us to add lenses that go to 0.95. We're about to announce about 3 new lenses next week, so be out on the lookout, but some new lenses that will be exciting as far as lens openings and everything else. Also, we wanted to take advantage for anybody that shoots Nikon already, but I mean, we wanted to take advantage of the same type of battery system. So if you've got a D750 or a D850 or a D810 or heck, a D7200 or 7100, you can still utilize all of the same batteries and all of the same accessories and all of the same flash system and everything with this Nikon Z mount. So we wanted to have it incorporate with each other. Last but not least, by the year 2021, by the end of the year, next year, we should have about 23 lenses solely in the Z mount. We already have 99 lenses that already exist in the DSLR mount that you can adapt with the F mount adapter that you can utilize, and it will work perfectly across the board. Focusing, metering, exposure, no loss of light, no loss of quality, nothing. So this is a little bit unupdated because the 20 millimeter has already come out, and that 51.2 should be soon. We also have, a 28 and a 40 pancake lens that's coming out, a 60 and a 105 micro that's coming out, and we have a 14 to 24 that's going to be very, very soonly announced. The 2470 to 7200, the 14 to 30, 24 to 105. We just announced also a 24 to 200. That's already started shipping. By the way, you should, if you get a chance, even if you don't shoot Nikon, do yourself a favor, go to Hans or your local camera store and try that 24 to 200. It really is an amazing lens. It is easily the best all-in-one. If you want a run and gun, if you want a travel lens that is compact but sharp from corner to corner, from 24 millimeter to 200 millimeter, that 24 to 200 is an outstanding option. So we have a 100 to 400 and a 200 to 600. Like I said, we'll have 23 native lenses by the end of the year, and we currently have 99 lenses in the Nikon system that work perfectly across all of the functions of this camera with this Z-mount adapter. That's all I have for you guys. I hope you have some questions for me. I'll be more than glad to answer them. Even if you have questions about sensor size, all of that, I'll be more than happy to answer them for you.
Does anybody have any questions for Mike?
Maybe not.
I used to shoot the F2 back in the 70s, so I know what that's like.
Well, I mean, one of the great things about about these mirrorless cameras is that it's breathing new life into some of the old lenses, which is really, really cool. I'm having a blast shooting with some of my old lenses that are 30, 40, 50 years old and being able to mount them on the Z camera. And I mean, the beauty is, since you have in-body image stabilization on these cameras, to be able to mount those lenses and also have in-body image stabilization on those old lenses is, really a game changer. And you still have that personality of those older lenses that are imperfect, but still give you an amazing look to the image. Thanks,
Can I ask a favor, Mike? Can you make sure that when Noah sends his information, that he goes ahead and sends your information also? Would that be okay?
That's perfectly fine. 100%. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions, guys.
Okay, we need to have a question here. What's the difference with the Z6 and Z7? What's the difference between the two?
The biggest difference is, again, megapixels. The Z6 is a 24 and a half megapixel camera, and the Z7 is basically about 46 megapixels. It's 45.9 megapixels, so round up 46 megapixels. I would say that the Z6 is the best all-arounder. So if you do a little bit of everything from sports to indoor shooting to landscape, the Z6 is going to be your, jack of all trades. The Z7, still fantastic, and that's probably the camera that I use most because of the type of photography that I do. The Z7, if you tell me that you're going to be doing a landscape and architectural photography, the Z7 is probably a better platform because of the high megapixels.
Okay. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
John, let's hear about Sony.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, guys. Let me stop sharing.
Sorry, I was trying to mute Mike, John, and I got you. I apologize.
No problem. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm John Helgeson. Been working with Sony and Hunts Photo for about 15 years. My contact information is up there. In addition to our splash page for all things alpha, alphauniverse.com. And Noah is more than welcome to share my email and my contact information, and you can get it from, obviously, from your recording. So the story of Sony is kind of starts with the 5 fundamentals of and our standards for full frame mirrorless. We now have 57 lenses in our lineup. The mount is the same from our APS-C cameras to our full frame cameras. We are the only company that has that advantage. Because we've only been making lenses for mirrorless in the mirrorless era, our lenses are all optimized for that. They're all optimized for the resolution that we can produce with our sensors. And Sony sensors, by the way, are in more than half of all digital cameras in the world, way more than half of all smartphones. One of our goals in making these lenses is obviously image quality, but also size and weight. These 5 fundamentals sort of go into every component, whether it's the lens, the sensor, or any other part of the whole environment. The Sony has 4 different lens lines. Sony is the basic lines. You can get an 85-1.8 for $600 that some say outperforms the Zeiss 85-1.8. Very good values. Then you start with our G lineup, which comes from Minolta. That was their high grade line. We added Zeiss from the beginning of Sony's entrance into interchangeable lens photography in 2006 with Zeiss autofocus lenses. Zeiss autofocus are only on Sony for Sony mounts, and Zeiss designs and quality controls those lenses. The latest addition is the G Master lenses, which take the resolution to a whole nother level. Think sort of in terms of a lens today for tomorrow's resolution. And the first example, I guess, you'd think of with tomorrow's resolution is the A7R4 with 61 megapixels. Next is image quality. We have the most advanced sensor technology, probably the reason they're used in most cameras. Lens coatings, lens construction, the way the lenses are built. And I'm going to talk for a minute about our latest lens announcement at the end of my time. The third fundamental is speed. The first thing I think of is the speed that a sensor that is built for mirrorless cameras can do. Some added information for comparison between DSLR sensors and mirrorless sensors. In a way, there's no difference, and some of the sensors are used in both formats. The reality of a mirrorless sensor is that the way they work and the way that everything sort of takes place on the sensor means that artificial intelligence is a key advantage in a mirrorless design overall. And then the image quality, I would honestly say, is more advanced than DSLR because all the technology, all the R&D is going into mirrorless cameras because mirrorless cameras are selling at a much higher rate, or I should say at a growing rate as compared to other formats. So one of the technologies we invented and used and was utilized first in smartphone cameras was a stacked sensor, and that just translates into speed. If you want to email me and ask me to go into the detail, I will. But we have a camera that can do 60 autofocus and auto exposure calculations per second. Now, because of that, we can do 20 frames per second on that camera, and that's in silent mode. And that's with no blackout. So when you're shooting at 20 frames per second, you never lose sight of the subject. And it'll take you a couple of tries to even realize that your shutter is firing that fast. There are indicators on the electronic viewfinder, but it's an amazing experience. And the speed with which that we can focus on the human eye, we lead the industry in that category. And we have also added animal eye autofocus, which keeps improving and makes it a whole lot of fun to shoot with your camera with wildlife or sports or just your children running around the house. And fourth is battery life. Noah explained it well. Small cameras, smaller battery. In addition to that, mirrorless cameras, the sensor is always on, and that takes battery power to do that. The good news with Sony is we've been doing it a long time, and our power management is unparalleled. Our A7 III, which is our most popular full-frame camera, mirrorless, and Sony's been doing mirrorless full-frame longer than anybody. We're up to 710 shots per battery, and that is using the mechanical shutter. You can go a lot longer using the electronic shutter, which means the shutter mechanism itself is not operating. It's all done electronically in terms of the image being scanned to the sensor. And then compact and lightweight. Again, Noah's right. If you're using a full-frame camera with a very fast lens, the camera's going to get bigger and heavier than an APS-C camera with a little pancake lens on it. But that camera's still going to be smaller and lighter than the old DSLRs, which can make a big difference if you're shooting for a long period of time or you're carrying a serious amount of gear. And again, they're still at least a little bit smaller and lighter, but we're not really sacrificing. We have dual card slots, microphone and headphone jacks, HDMI, USB-C, and micro USB, and the cameras are fully equipped. So back to the one mount. We kind of joke around and refer to that as one mount to rule them all. But that is a big deal because you don't have to consider if the lens you had on your older mirrorless camera will fit on your new full-frame Sony mirrorless camera. They're all interchangeable. Now, obviously, most of the time you're going to be using full-frame mirrorless, full-frame lenses there's not a lot of good reason to use a APS-C lens on a on a full frame mirrorless unless you are really looking to reduce the size and weight of your rig. But this advantage goes between APS-C and full frame, amateurs and pros, stills, and video. Now, as far as adapters go, we don't make the adapters that will adapt you to Canon or Nikon, but you should know that Canon lenses are more likely to allow you to autofocus. Just a quick thing, generally L glass works better, and the newer L glass even a little better than that. We've gotten reports that there really isn't any loss in focus speed mounting certain Canon glass on Sony full frame cameras. Most of our enthusiasts, I guess, use either Sigma or Metabones. Sigma's advantage is that they have support here in the US. And more of our pro shooters do work with the Sigma adapter. It's about, I think it's about $150, sometimes on sale for less. The Metabones is quite a bit more expensive. So here's just a little hero shot of our lenses. Like I said, we're up to 57. 37 of them are full frame. By the end of 2021, who knows how many lenses we'll have. But our latest lens is the 12 to 24 G Master. That brings us to two 12 to 24 wide zoom lenses. The other one is f4 and it's G lens. This is the world's widest full frame at 12 millimeters with constant f2.8. So if you think about that, f2.8 throughout the run, this thing will be the equivalent of, I don't know, 4 to 6 prime lenses, you know, a 12 f2.8, a 16 f2.8, etc. This uses more of the high-end glass. We call it, sorry about that. We make something called extra spherical. We're the only ones who do that. But you add those lenses along with the super ED and ED glass. There's 9 elements that are of that quality and above. We also are using our highest grade XD, which is our extreme dynamic linear motor. And I won't go into the to the possibly boring features of that, but basically really no moving parts, silent, and the fastest lens, the fastest motors that you can get. This lens will be available on August 13th, and it is available to order now. I did leave out the weight of this lens, which is pretty amazing. There is a similar lens out there and that are at similar weights, but they're either not as wide or they're not f2.8. For example, there's a competitor that has an 11 to 24 f4 that's 1,180 grams. Ours is 847 grams. So we're one of our key things in this approach that we look for is lightweight, as well as trying to keep the camera size down as compared to our competitors. So that's what I have for you. I'd love to answer some questions. Thank you.
I do have a couple. One of the club's sisters actually has one of your Sony cameras that has a touchscreen on the back, and it has an aggravating feature of her nose resetting the focus point when she puts it up to her viewfinder. I'm assuming there's a setting that you can fix that, right?
Sure. You can turn off the touch screen. A thing to keep in mind with the Sony cameras is that there are at least 11 buttons that you can customize, choosing amongst 70 or 80 different functions. So you can actually just hit a button and turn off the touchpad setting, and the nose focus will stop.
Thanks. Will you be coming out with, will Sony be coming out with the RX10 Mark V soon?
I've worked with Sony for 15 years, but I've worked with other companies, and Sony is by far the most secretive. We're told that that's because our technology leads, and we're trying to maintain that that advantage. So I can tell you that most likely there will be another one, but when, I don't know. There are articles out there regarding another camera. My team hasn't officially informed us, but there's a lot of talk about a new Alpha 7S model. The RX10 Mark IV is pretty darn advanced. We just added through a firmware upgrade for no charge animal eye autofocus to that camera. So, I learned a long time ago not to guess at what Sony will do next, because I'm wrong in my guesses more often than not.
It's one thing I found, at least with Mirrorless, is that you get a lot of features through firmware upgrades that you don't necessarily have to buy a new camera to get a lot of those new features when they come out with firmware upgrades.
Yeah, we've been doing that a lot, especially the past couple of years, for sure.
What about the Sony RX10? Is that a pretty good camera?
It's an amazing camera. I've talked to 50-year professionals that have switched to Sony for 10 years or 5 years, and they tell me that in their old newspaper days, they could have done their photojournalism with an RX10, and this is going back to the first version. 99% of the time, that camera would have done the job. Just amazing for video. Our creators that are doing video and still work love the ability to go back and forth, and everything's all in one piece, and they call it a run and gun video solution. But at 600 millimeters at f4, that's a pretty amazing capability. Now, it's a 1-inch sensor. It's not an APS-C or full frame, but the results you get speak for themselves. And just read the reviews, look at some of the Facebook user groups, and get some unbiased opinions. But the stories I've heard of people with shooting weddings and whatever with these cameras is just an amazing camera.
Thanks, John. I do actually have one more question for Mike. Why did Nikon choose to use the QXD format and the new Z series versus adding an SD slot also?
That's it. Am I? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
You're on, yeah.
Okay. The reason that we went with XQD, well, funny enough, XQD, we came out with XQD, and we've been probably since the D4, if I remember correctly, the first D4. It seemed like we were crazy coming out with a completely new format. And the funny thing is that we've stayed with the XQD format, and it's kind of been basically proven right. When I say that is, if you take a look at what the new camera manufacturers are doing, they're now using CF Express. XQD and CF Express, for all intents and purposes, is basically the same format. It's kind of like saying with an SD card, UHS-1 versus UHS-2. So XQD and CF Express, they both fit in the same slot. They're basically the same camera. or excuse me, format. So now, if you take a look at what all of the other manufacturers are doing, they're all switching to XQD and CF Express. You look at Panasonic's newest camera, the S1 and the S2, they're using XQD and CF Express. Canon just announced a fantastic camera, you know, by all looks, which is the R5, which happens to use CF Express and XQD. Sony's top of the line pro video cameras all use XQD, or use XQD, I should say, not all of them. So what you're seeing is that slowly there's a transition to XQD from SD cards. Are SD cards inexpensive? Absolutely. Are XQD cards or CF Express cards expensive? Yes, they are. But the best way that I can equate it is an XQD or CF Express card is the closest thing to a solid state drive on a computer. So they are the most, or the least corruptible of any card format because of the way that it stores the information. They have the fastest read and write speeds of any card on the market. They're the best weather sealed of any card on the market. So that's why we went to an XQD format. Would it have been easier on us if we had gone with SD, which, you know, you can buy $10 SD cards? By the way, I don't recommend you buying $10 SD cards unless you're in a pinch, because the highest failure rate of any card system on the market is from SD. They have a higher failure rate than even the old, what was it called? The CF cards, the old CF cards. They have a higher failure rate, SD cards, than even the old CF cards. XQD has the least per use failure rate of any other card. So I expect that you'll see more and more manufacturers moving over to XQD, especially as 4K and 8K video and higher frame rates start to take advantage of these read and write speeds. I think that you'll start seeing that more and more. So even though we were one of the first ones to go out with it, it's been proven that there's a reason why, and that's basically making it kind of foolproof, you know, over the years.
Thanks, Mike. Does anybody have any other questions, either for Mike or John or Noah?
If not, I will just mention, I did say I was going to mention briefly about the new Canon announcement the other day. So if there are any Canon shooters out there who have been anticipating and waiting this new EOS R5 camera or the R6, they did also come out with a couple new lenses, a 100 to 500, a 600 f11, and an 800 f11, as well as an 85 millimeter macro. Not a true macro, it's a 1:2, so it's not a 1:1 macro, but they did come out with that 85 macro as well. We are taking pre-orders and all of that stuff, so if you guys have any interest in any of it or want to know more about it, please do send me an email. It is pretty interesting, and it's definitely a next step in the mirrorless generation. As Mike was saying, both of those cameras now implement that new CF Express / XQD card slot. So you will, as Mike mentioned, start seeing more cameras coming out and using that card format, as again, it is kind of future-proof and a lot safer and much faster. So if you guys have any questions on that or interested in pre-ordering or anything like that, please do send me an email and I'll be happy to get that information to you or add you to our pre-order list.
Thank you guys very much. And John, one quick request is, if you had a chance, would you send the link for the Sony lens roadmap with your info so I can include it to the group?
Sure, I'll send that to Noah.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
All right, thanks everybody again for getting on and spending for me, it was very informational, almost a couple hours. And thanks again, Noah, for putting this together. Appreciate it very much.
You, Jerry.
And we'll send all the info around to everybody, and I'll put the recording out on the website. Thanks,
All right, everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you all soon.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.